I think this incursion itself is in the balance at the moment. I think it's too early, genuinely, to say if it has been a success, but certainly they've stunned the Russians, put them on the back foot, and for the first time in several months asking them questions. When it comes to F-16s, look, like you say, they're never going to have, a huge amount to compete with the Russian Air Force, but what they can act as is a sufficient deterrent for the cost of Russian fighter jets.
How aware will ordinary Russians be of what's happening in the Kursk region? Clearly, if you live in Kursk Oblast, if you live in Belgorod, which has been evacuated, you will be conscious of it. But if you're an ordinary Russian in Moscow or St. Petersburg, is this on the news? Are they talking about this? Or is this so embarrassing they're trying to cover it up?
Well, Putin did, effectively, I mean, it's not a press conference because no one gets to ask any questions, but he did that kind of classic staging of himself, giving orders and kind of telling off his officials for not foreseeing this, not preventing this well enough. He did all that, so they've certainly acknowledged it. But bear in mind, Russia is a big country, and most events in Russia to most Russians feel distant because they are. So the degree to which we can expect some sort of political fallout to come from this, no one should be getting over optimistic about this.
But clearly that is one of the potential objectives of the Ukrainians, to make ordinary Russians realise that this war, this special military operation that may have felt quite distant from them, suddenly feels much closer.
I think that's true, and I think that has been going on for a while as well. Bear in mind, they have been carrying out long-range drone strikes as well across Russia and hitting oil refineries and getting up to all sorts of skullduggery to try and, like you say, bring the war to Russia. That's definitely an aim. But also, I don't think we should lose fact of just the pure military fact that they have been on the back foot. They needed something to change the dynamic. I'll credit him for it, but John Foreman, who is the former British defence attaché in Moscow and a very, very wise head on all these matters, he kind of gave me the analogy of a boxer. I don't know if you follow boxing at all, but if anyone who watched the Usyk-Tyson Fury fights, you will remember how Usyk, a Ukrainian, much smaller boxer, outthought and outmaneuvered a much larger lumbering figure, with deft footwork and, keeping him moving, and that you can start to see how that analogy applies to the situation where Ukraine, a much smaller army, needs to fight a war that is swifter, and they are dictating the terms, and it's done with a nimbleness and a speed that doesn't favour the Russian army, and in fact makes their size and the fact that they're trying to kind of have supply lines across, this huge army, make that into a weakness if they can. The danger with that, though, is that obviously creating a new section of front line means that arguably the Ukrainians with a smaller army have to patrol that and defend that, and that poses another significant problem for them, arguably.
Vladimir Putin also said in that televised statement you referenced a moment ago, George, that he thinks this is part of a negotiating strategy by Ukraine. What is your reading on that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we have the US presidential elections coming up. Donald Trump has said within 24 hours of taking office, he plans to do a deal. Bear in mind, he was the one who met with Putin previously in Helsinki, famously at a summit. He thinks that he has some sort of relationship, and he thinks that by having talks with him and Zelensky, he can force a peace settlement. Now, as anyone will tell you, as any diplomat will tell you, you don't, or any businessman will tell you, you don't go into talks or you don't initiate talks when you have a weaker hand. And up until this invasion, arguably Ukraine did have a weaker hand, and the Russians could dictate the terms of any talks. So having some sort of leverage is useful. I think that is predicated, though, on a tricky problem, though, for the Ukrainians, which is they would have to hold on to this land. And, even if by November, let's say Trump does win, and then by January he's inaugurated and he starts talks, that's a long period of time for them to hold this land. So I'm not as convinced by that argument. And then there are some more fanciful ideas that they're going to take the nuclear power plant outside Kursk and use that as a bargaining chip for the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. I think that's a little far-fetched.
What do you think the response has been privately in the capitals of Washington and London and Paris and Berlin and among Ukraine's Western allies? Will they be tacitly endorsing this? It was interesting, James Heapy, the former UK Armed Forces Minister, was on Times Radio Breakfast saying that he welcomes this, but he's a former politician now. If he was still the Armed Forces Minister, he would have to give a different line and he wouldn't be able to publicly endorse this. How fine a line are Ukraine's Western allies having to tread on this?
Well, I think that's another point of the invasion. So the Germans and the Americans have stressed they didn't know anything about it. Now, the huge diplomatic own goal of that offensive on Kharkiv earlier this year was that it unlocked American approval for cross-border strikes into Russia. So by hiding behind that border, which was previously a red line, the Russians could drop glide bombs on Kharkiv and were doing so liberally. And it was threatening, Ukraine's ability to defend itself. That led to Biden saying, yes, you can use ATACMS to hit Russian sites across the border. They're now taking this further. They are using Marders, Strikers, German and American armored vehicles to invade Russia, further pushing the boat out on what they can do across the border, normalizing the idea of using Western weapons in Russia. And I think that, them setting the agenda for that is really interesting, particularly bearing in mind that they have just received their first F-16s and F-16s, arguably their use is only going to become a real factor in the war if they are allowed to fire across the border and stop Russian jets from dropping glide bombs from the safety of Russian airspace.
And with the F-16s, I know a lot of analysts have said, look, with the numbers that Ukraine currently has and with the issues around training of the fighter pilots, we shouldn't overstate their likely impact. But do you think the fact that they have now arrived in Ukraine and they will start being deployed, coupled with this incursion into Kursk, means that the momentum is now decisively with Ukraine?
I wouldn't go as far as to say decisively. I think this incursion itself is in the balance at the moment. I think it's too early, genuinely, to say if it has been a success. But certainly they've stunned the Russians, put them on the back foot, and for the first time in several months, asking them questions. When it comes to F-16s, look, like you say, they're never going to have, a huge amount to compete with the Russian Air Force, but what they can act as is a sufficient deterrent for the cost of Russian fighter jets, operating just inside Russia from being too high. That the cost benefit of being able to drop glide bombs from close to the border is not worth the risk and the cost of losing an aircraft potentially to an F-16 armed with an air-to-air missile.